jinxed. Arda just got jinxed. He remembered the elements of all the literature works from Earth. The fictional books had many common recurring themes called cliches, one of which was the idea of someone jinxing themselves for thinking or saying something hopeful while openly welcoming the opposite of that. Simplified definition, but it was close enough. Now, this was obviously not just a story, but this was definitely a cliche. Because by thinking that, Arda just jinxed himself and Blake. Arda just jinxed them. The utter irony. Due to the complicated circumstances, they decided to stay in the facility for a bit longer. It wasn't the worst place to spend the last possible day, insert major question marks, on the planet. There was food, somehow not spoiled despite having been there for apparently millions of years, and they were tasteless, which Blake seemed to appreciate at the moment. On that subject, Arda figured it was actually more than millions of years since his and Blake's creation. There were maps in the facility stored in hologram devices. They were mostly used for studying animal habitats, simulating and studying behaviors based on their environment, observing their migration routes and such. However, when Arda zoomed out, he could see the entire globe. Dragging the stylus across a small square pad under the projection, the action was mirrored on the hologram as the planet spun around, allowing Arda to study it. It was the typical view of the Earth, which Arda had pretty much memorized already. However, Arda tapped a finger on the table as he thought, only partly aware of Blake in the background, poking at the equipment and interested things in the testing areas, those that existed on Earth but not on Zeta, or things that he had never seen before. Rubik's cubes, chess pieces, a few wind instruments, and string instruments. He fiddled with the keys of a flute, and when they did nothing, he went on to mess with the keyboard on the grand piano. The A key rang out, and he jumped back, then fell on his butt when he tripped on a ball that rolled underfoot. Back! Arda ignored him, like the mature million-plus-year-old he was. His point was that the geography of Earth in the 34th and 35th centuries were too different from Zeta's. He'd studied the maps back at the Sector 8 base, and he knew that there were 3 continents on Zeta: Dorzak, Zanti, and Itigwez. And the 100 Celestial Isles could be counted as a continent, but it was rather controversial. The 100 Celestial Isles were essentially a large patch of ocean with thousands of islands. It was also the main target of the moon's debris, with the richest deposit of lunar rocks and soil. Itigwez and Zanti were connected by a land bridge from north to south, while Dorzak was completely surrounded by water. The geographical factor was the main reason he had been so reluctant to believe that Zeta was Earth. There was no resemblance whatsoever. If it had been millions of years in the future from the 35th century, there would still be some similarities. If it was hundreds of millions of years, there would be a supercontinent. And a few hundreds of millions of years after that, it would have broken off again. So, at least 400 or 500 million years would have passed since Earth went into cryostasis. And if Arda floating around in space at 10% light speed, visiting 783 other planets was any indication, definitely longer. What was also strange and kind of funny was that by having created Arda using the sun's energy and having Arda's entanglement with the sun's stars shrink it, Quinn Kendall essentially saved the human race. After all, if the sun hadn't shrunk, the surface temperature of the Earth would have increased significantly, and eventually caused the planet to become uninhabitable. So everything worked out in the end. But although the dot logically reassured him, Arda felt like there was a stone in his gut, weighing him down. It was still hard to believe Zeta was Earth, and it was the home of the human race, still habitable, still containing complex life and organisms. Except, if the moon became close enough to the Earth to form a ring, the population sank from 8 billion to just a few million, and still sank by the day, the hour, the minute, all because of Arda's arrival. He didn't realize until he heard a snap that he clenched the stylus too tightly. Arda? Blake called out from the other side of the lab. A look of concern clearly etched in his face despite the distance between them. You sure you're feeling okay? How was Blake doing this? How could he just turn the tables around again and go from him comforting Arda to Arda comforting him and back to Blake comforting Arda? Hypocrite, Arda just muttered and left it at that. He heard anyway. What? Hey, jerk! After everything we've been through? And what do you mean by that anyway? Mind you, it was a heartfelt, genuine question. I'm just stating what I'm seeing and observing from you. There shouldn't be any real debate, because it's the hard truth. Blake chucked the ball he tripped over at Arda. It somehow sailed all the way across the room and hit him in the forehead, where it bounced off harmlessly. Arda hid the small, amused smile he, for some stupid reason, could not resist. But it faded quickly enough. They both knew what they were doing. Trying to distract themselves, trying to have good memories of each other, no matter what Arda decided. He still couldn't make up his mind. He didn't want to, not yet. Blake. So, remember when Arda mentioned he jinxed them? There was a muffled bang from above them, followed by more, and then a chain of tiny explosions that nearly drowned out the sound of the wind. Screams suddenly erupted from above, the sound of the wounded and dying. Commotion seemed to break out all over Kendall Square. Guns, Blake blurted, looking up. Imperialist guns. Oh, of course. They're attacking. They've betrayed the truth with Karata. Or maybe the people from Zanti sent to take the prisoners took the chance to ambush us. In any case, they still broke the truce, Arda agreed, weaving quickly through the maze of tables and chairs to the elevator in the middle. Blake was closer, and had already entered a glass cylinder. His gun, non-lethal of course, was in his hands, which he flipped over and over. Arda, Blake said in a low tone. Arda looked at him as the lift started its ascent. He was doing something, though Arda wasn't sure for what purpose. He pulled his hair tie out and put it in one of his many pockets, and put his orange scarf around his neck, but making sure his red tie was visible. His hair flowed freely as he secured his visor and goggles. Arda stared at him. Are you going for a confusion tactic? Blake gave him a half-hearted smile before putting on his mask. We've got the element of surprise and confusion. I'm going to use that and knock out as many Imperialists as I can, but I need you to cover me, so I don't get shot by my own people. You're invincible enough. He fluffed up the orange scarf to make it even more obvious. Arda nodded in agreement, but couldn't quite understand just one aspect of this. So then, why do you have your hair down? Simultaneously, he looked up and pressed a button. The glass all around them slid down, out of the way smoothly except for 2 support beams that held up the ceiling. Blake gave him a thumbs up. Thanks. I was just going to ask if the door can stay open, and my hair, more confusion. I'm kind of known for my long hair and ponytail in Sector 8. Also, it's colder than usual. This helps. Arda stared some more, and wondered why or how in the world he managed to grow locks this long. Did Cleona create him with the intention to have a real-life Rapunzel? Then he shook his head and took out his gun as well. I'll cover you. We're arriving in the square in 3, 2, 1... Snow was suddenly falling into the elevator from the surface. The wind rushed into the elevator, bringing with it a chill. The sound of gunshots ceased slightly. Arda stood back to back with Blake, and as soon as their line of vision were above the blanket of snow, they shot at every Imperialist in sight. Chaos immediately erupted again. The people previously staring at the rising elevator, confused, were all raising their guns again, pointing the barrels at the other sides and at Arda and Blake. It was an unusual scene and, in a way, blood-chilling. Red stained the pure white of the snow. Everywhere, signs of the injured were visible, and shapes were drawn in the ground. The Imperialists advanced in the open with large shields and deadly weapons. The North Sphere hid wherever they could, climbing the buildings in the alleyways, behind broken lampposts, or making a temporary barrier with the snow. They were quite efficient, but, despite the fact, the heaviest casualties, naturally, belonged to Sector 8. And one of them, or nearly one of them, was Jada, stranded out in the open, holding a wound on her side, her other hand holding her gun unwavering as she shot down any Imperialist that dared to peek above their shields, walking forward. As he watched, a bullet pierced her leg and she screamed, stumbling, nearly slipping. But then she took that split second to reload her gun, swiftly, somehow with one hand. She stood back up and limped forward again, as if the blood gushing from her legs was no big deal. Her goggles had been grazed by that bullet and slid off her face, showing her eyes, set with determination. Dozens fell to her gun alone, but there were still dozens more. Another scream, also familiar. Arda turned his head and saw Tink falling from the window of a building into the snow below. He heard a shout, which he recognized as Karatos. "Retreat! Sector 8, retreat!" Upon hearing that, the Imperialists only pressed on with more vigor. That was the day Arda first felt anger. Not all Imperialists were bad, he knew, and he experienced it firsthand. But these were. Blake must have felt it too. He broke away from Arda and ran towards the Imperialists, hiding his gun. At first, they were confused, but then, as the blonde got closer, they must have realized that something was off. However, they didn't react out of uncertainty, letting him slip behind their barriers to avoid shots from his own people. "Arda!" Jada's voice reached him, and he glanced over. She had gotten another wound on the left shoulder. It was a wonder she was still standing from the blood loss. Her eyes were ablaze. "Are you okay?" Arda nodded in confirmation before running forward and blocking a bullet headed for her. It pierced his chest. Pain erupted where it hit, but if he was being frank, it was nothing compared to the mental struggles he'd had to deal with, nor when he was struck by lightning twice. He brushed it off and shot the exposed hand holding the gun. The Imperialist collapsed not long after. "Wow, that would have been totally dramatic, except that you acted like it was nothing," Arda called. How did she have the energy to be sarcastic in this condition? You could have at least pretended like it hurt. Before Arda could respond, the ground suddenly shook violently, shaking several people off their feet. An earthquake. A major one, around a 9, perhaps, triggered by Arda's anger, no doubt. However, Cultus, being built millions of years ago as the strongest city in the world, lived up to its legacy and held itself together impressively. At the same time, dozens of Imperialists suddenly fell, as if something was passing through them. A ripple passed through the Imperialist ranks, and gunshots ceased completely for a few moments. Some of them turned around in a panic. Before they could, Blake felled them with a few trigger pulls. Blake ran forward, snatching one of the Imperialist shields and held them up as gunshots hurled towards them. They bounced off the metal, and were completely caught off guard when Blake lunged towards the nearest standing enemy. They both crashed into the snow, and the Imperialists hit their head on their own shield, promptly passing out. Blake pulled away his gun, took the lethal one from the Imperialist, and shot towards the sky. Apparently, being unused to their own weapon being used against them, that or the fact that they were against a deadly, angry berserker who single-handedly took down a good chunk of their numbers, they retreated with shouts of alarm. Though the bullets Blake shot never hit anyone, the threat of it was enough to send them packing. Still, he solidified his point when he whirled around and threw his rectangular shield like a frisbee, nailing an enemy who crashed into the ground. Then Karato shouted orders to block off the Imperialist retreat, and the battle pretty much ended there. All thanks to the merciless one-man maniac that was Blake Kendallsill. As Arda helped Jada, carefully patching her up temporarily until she had a proper medic who had the supplies to heal her, he couldn't stop thinking about how Blake was so much more talented than he gave himself credit for. Whether or not it was the fact of being an artificial human, it was something he had, undeniably. If only he would stop pulling himself back because of Cleona and let go. He tried to search for Blake, but he didn't want to be found. Several sources mentioned that he'd gone back to the base for supplies, so Arda forced himself to quit worrying. He went around as Kendall Square became a temporary medical camp for those too injured to move into the buildings, trying to help out where he could, checking on Loris, who somehow got snow in their lungs before they melted and turned into water that she coughed up. For the stealthy one, she did something even Arda thought was impossible. Tink was not dead, at least not yet. She was shot twice in the abdomen, one piercing her small intestine, the other missing a vital organ but went right through her. She'd landed on her arm before the fall and broke the bone, despite the snow to cushion her fall. Her head might also be in critical condition, with a possible concussion. She was suffering from blood loss, internal bleeding, possible infection, fever, hypothermia, possible concussion, and possible shock. But, at the very least, she wasn't dead.